There is a photograph kept now in the provincial archives of Alberta of a man named Swift Runner taken shortly before his execution in the winter of 1879. And he does not look like a man who has spent a winter starving in the bush. He looks well-fed. That single detail, more than any confession, is what convicted him, and it is the place where this story has to begin. Because everything that came after it depended on a fact that the frontier authorities could not get around. Swift Runner was not hungry. He had food, he killed and ate his family anyway. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was one of the hardest the Cree of what is now central Alberta had endured in a generation. The buffalo herds that had sustained plains and parkland peoples for centuries were collapsing under decades of overhunting and the slow encroachment of rail lines and settler agriculture. And entire bands were going hungry in a way that had no precedent within living memory. Swift Runner, known to his own people as Ka-Ki-Si-Kutchin, was by all accounts a capable man before that winter, a tall, powerfully built hunter who had served as a guide for the newly formed Northwest Mounted Police, trusted enough to be paid in cash for his knowledge of the country. But he had also developed a reputation for violence during drinking bouts, bad enough that the police eventually cut him loose and sent him back to his band, and his own people, in turn, had pushed him out. A man with nowhere else to go took his family into the bush to live as trappers always had, off whatever the land would give them. That family numbered 9. His wife Charlotte, his mother, his brother, and 6 children, the youngest still an infant. In the spring, only Swift Runner walked out. He arrived at a Catholic mission near St. Albert and told the priests there a simple story. The winter had been merciless. Everyone had starved. He alone had survived. It was on its face not an unbelievable account, because frontier winters did kill whole families, and the missionaries had buried the evidence of it before. But the priests who took him in noticed something that did not fit the story he was telling them. A man who has survived a winter of starvation does not usually look like Swift Runner looked. He carried weight on his frame. His color was good, and at night, in the small room they had given him, he screamed in his sleep and woke thrashing, soaked through, begging something unseen to leave him alone. They reported their unease to the Northwest Mounted Police, and a small party, with Swift Runner himself, volunteering to guide them, rode out to the family's winter camp on a tributary of what is now called the Sturgeon River, northwest of Fort Saskatchewan. What they found there ended any possibility that this was an ordinary tragedy of the frontier. The camp was scattered with human remains. Bones had been deliberately broken open, the marrow sucked out. There was evidence that flesh had been cut from the larger bones with some care, the way a hunter dresses game. One child, the eldest report later confirmed, appeared to have died of natural causes and had been properly buried separate from the others, as if even in the depths of whatever had taken hold of him. Some fragment of the father in Swift Runner had insisted on burying that one child with dignity. The other 8 were not buried at all. They were processed. When the investigating officers asked him directly what had happened, Swift Runner did not deny anything. He did not claim an accident, or an attack by strangers, or any of the evasions a guilty man typically reaches for. He told them, in his own language, and later through an interpreter, that a Witiko had come into him. I want to stay with that word for a moment because the version of this creature that has traveled into American popular culture, the antlered skeletal thing from video games and prestige television, is largely an invention of the 20th century, grafted onto a name borrowed from a tradition that predates any of it by centuries. The Wendigo or Witiko, depending on which Algonquian language community you ask, belongs to the oral traditions of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Naskapi, and other peoples across the boreal forest belt stretching from the Rocky Mountain foothills to the Atlantic coast of Quebec and Labrador. It is one of the very few cryptids in North American folklore that genuinely predates European contact and was not retrofitted onto a region by a later writer looking for local color. The earliest written European account of it comes not from a tabloid or a campfire collection, but from the Jesuit Relations. the meticulous reports Catholic missionaries sent back to France through the 17th century. In 1661, a Jesuit father recorded an encounter with Cree people who had been struck by what he called an illness unknown to the missionaries themselves, one that left its victims consumed by an unnatural hunger for human flesh, so total and so far beyond ordinary starvation that the community itself had judged it necessary to kill the afflicted before the hunger could spread further. The Jesuit was not describing folklore he had heard about. He was describing something he had personally witnessed the aftermath of, recorded with the same dry administrative tone he used to describe crop yields and weather. What the Cree and Ojibwe understood the Wendigo to be was not primarily a monster that lived in the woods waiting to be hunted, although there are stories of that kind too. It was, at its core, a moral and spiritual category, a name for what happens to a human being who gives in entirely to selfish consumption at the expense of the community around them. In a subsistence economy built on sharing what little the land provided, during the lean months the worst thing a person could become was someone who hoarded, who consumed without limit, who put his own appetite above the survival of everyone around him. The Wendigo was the literal embodiment of that failure, often described as a giant emaciated figure with skin stretched tight over its bones, lips torn away by its own teeth, a heart made of ice, and an emptiness that no amount of eating could ever fill, because its hunger grew in exact proportion to what it consumed. To become Wendigo was not simply to be possessed by an external demon in the way European folklore imagines possession. It was to become, through extremity of circumstance and moral collapse, the very thing the entire culture had built its survival ethics around guarding against. And this is where the story stops being only folklore and becomes something genuinely strange in the historical record. Through the 18th and especially the 19th century, anthropologists, missionaries, and colonial officials working across this same boreal region began documenting cases that were not metaphorical at all. Individuals, almost always in the depths of a harsh winter, isolated, frequently, though not always genuinely starving, would report being overtaken by an overwhelming compulsion to kill and eat the people closest to them, even when other food was available. The condition came to be called in the clinical language of the era Wendigo psychosis, and it was taken seriously enough that it appears in psychological and anthropological literature well into the 20th century as a so-called culture-bound syndrome, a pattern of mental breakdown that seemed to express itself specifically through the symbolic vocabulary available to people raised inside Algonquian cosmology. Some afflicted individuals begged their own families to kill them before they could act on the compulsion, and were killed by relatives with what anthropologists who studied the practice described as a kind of communal, almost ceremonial grief, an act of mercy and self-defense at once, sanctioned by the same belief system that had produced the affliction. Other communities developed entire bodies of practice around identifying the earliest warning signs: a particular coldness in the eyes, a refusal of normal food, dreams of ice and snow, and intervening before the transformation could complete itself. Whether Wendigo psychosis was a genuine, distinct psychiatric phenomenon, or whether it was something closer to a culturally available script that severely traumatized or mentally ill individuals reached for to explain behavior that had other roots entirely, remains a live argument among anthropologists today. The condition essentially disappears from the record over the course of the 20th century, which itself is suggestive fading in step with the same forces that were dismantling the isolated, subsistence-based winter camp as a way of life across the boreal interior. Whatever it was bound tightly to a specific set of conditions: extreme isolation, extended cold, scarcity, and a cultural framework that gave a name and a shape to a particular kind of psychological collapse. Take away the isolation and the framework, and the condition seems to have largely gone with it. Which brings us back to a freezing morning in Fort Saskatchewan in December of 1879, and to a man whose case sits at the exact center of that unresolved argument. The trial itself, held earlier that August before Judge Richardson, was by the standards of frontier justice almost perfunctory. Swift Runner did not contest the facts. He had killed them. He had eaten them. He said so himself, repeatedly, without the evasions of a man trying to escape the rope. What he disputed as much as a Cree man in an English colonial courtroom in 1879 had any real power to dispute anything was the framing of what he had done. He had not killed his family the way a man kills out of rage or greed. He had been the Witiko's instrument. The hunger had not been his own. It is here that I want to introduce a figure who does not appear by name in any of the surviving trial records, because the historical record of Swift Runner's defense is thin almost to the point of non-existence. A single overworked frontier lawyer assigned a case everyone already considered settled before it began. But somebody did sit across from Swift Runner in that cold guardroom in the weeks before the trial. Somebody had to take down his account, weigh it against the physical evidence, and decide what, if anything, could be said on his behalf in a courtroom built entirely on the premise that men are rational actors responsible for their choices. Let us call that man Edmund Hale, an invented composite of the kind of lawyer the frontier produced in genuine numbers, educated in England, trained in the strict empiricism of Victorian law, posted out to the territories more for ambition than conviction and entirely unprepared for what he was about to be asked to believe. Hale's case file, as we might imagine it, would have started the way any rationalist's notes start, with the facts arranged neatly, the medical evidence cataloged, the obvious explanation underlined. Starvation cannibalism was a known, documented, even legally distinguishable phenomenon. Famine had driven shipwrecked sailors and trapped pioneers to eat the dead before, and English and Canadian law had some history of treating those cases with a measure of grim sympathy. If Swift Runner's family had genuinely starved and he alone had resorted to the unthinkable to survive, there was at least a path toward leniency, a recognized category of human desperation the court could process without difficulty. Hale would have built his entire defense around proving exactly that. The problem, the one that should have been an easy defense and instead became the case's central horror, was that the physical evidence would not cooperate. Swift Runner was not emaciated. He had not been wasting away on the long walk back to the mission. He carried weight, color, strength, all the markers of a man who had been eating consistently and well through the very months his family was dying. And when investigators retraced his trapline, they found snares still set, evidence of game in the area, indications that food, while scarce, had not been entirely absent. This was not a starving man making the worst choice available to him. By every standard Hale's training had given him for evaluating human motive, the facts did not add up to a comprehensible crime. A man does not need to eat his 6 children, his wife, his mother, and his brother, methodically over the course of an entire winter, while game remains in his snares. We can imagine what this would have done to a man like Hale, sitting in that guardroom across from someone who would not, who genuinely seemed unable to give him the answer his legal training required. Swift Runner was not lying to escape punishment. Men trying to escape the rope in 1879 did not confess freely, and then crack jokes with the priest assigned to console them the night before their hanging, as Swift Runner reportedly did, presenting his guard with his own pipe and a beaded ceremonial neckpiece as parting gifts, settling his affairs with something closer to peace than terror. He was not insane in any way. The frontier doctors of the era had a category for either. He was lucid, cooperative, able to recount the winter in exact and terrible detail. What he offered instead was an account that simply did not fit inside the explanatory machinery English law had brought across the Atlantic. He told Hale that he remembered, with total clarity, watching himself do these things and being unable to stop, because the thing doing them was no longer entirely him. He used the word his people used. The Witiko had been inside him, and it had wanted what it wanted, and a man's will, however strong, was apparently no match for it once it had truly taken hold. A rationalist confronted with an account like that has broadly 3 ways to file it. He can decide the man is lying, constructing an elaborate cultural alibi to mitigate sentencing, though nothing else about Swift Runner's behavior in custody supports that reading. He can decide the man is mad in the period's blunt sense of the word, though here too, the doctors who examined him kept running into a frustrating coherence. A prisoner who could discuss the weather his trapline, his children's names, and the exact sequence of his crimes with the same even tone. Or he can sit with the third, far more uncomfortable possibility, that there exists a category of human breakdown for which his own civilization's vocabulary simply has no ready word, one that another civilization, watching this same boreal forest for far longer than England had known, it existed, had already named, studied, and built an entire defensive apparatus of ritual and early warning around. Hale, if he was anything like the men his training would have produced, would have resisted that third possibility with everything in him, because to accept it was to accept that Cree cosmology had identified and mapped a genuine feature of the human mind under extremity that his own enlightenment, with its courts and its juries and its medical men, had simply never had occasion to look for. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one. Judge Richardson sentenced Swift Runner to hang at Fort Saskatchewan on December 20th of December, the first legal execution carried out in what would become Alberta. The mechanics of the hanging itself have survived in far more vivid detail than the trial that produced it, because the men running it had genuinely never done this before. The gallows trap had to be hastily rebuilt the morning of the execution after the assembled crowd, in want of kindling against the bitter cold, had quietly burned the original trapdoor for firewood. The hangman, an elderly pensioner named Rogers, brought in for the occasion, discovered he had forgotten the straps needed to pinion the prisoner's arms and had to send someone running back for them while Swift Runner sat by one of the bystanders' fires, the noose already loose around his neck, eating pemmican and chatting amiably with the guards, at one point offering with what witnesses described as genuine good humor to simply kill himself with a tomahawk and spare everyone the further trouble of getting the apparatus working. He had, by every account left to us, made some kind of peace that the men hanging him plainly had not. Among the young constables guarding him in those final weeks was a 15-year-old bugler named Fred Bagley, who had picked up enough Cree during his service to talk with the prisoner directly, and who would later write decades on, as one of the last surviving witnesses, that Swift Runner never fully shook the hunger, even at the very end, that he would watch the well-fed constables pass his cell with an expression Bagley could only describe as something between hunger and grief, murmuring half in jest and half not that a particular heavy-set guard would make fine eating, holding up his fingers to estimate the fat on the man's ribs. It is a detail almost too grotesque to include, and yet it is precisely the kind of detail that resists either of the comfortable readings. It is not the behavior of a man performing madness for sympathy, alone in a cell with nothing left to gain from the performance. It is also not quite the behavior of a man simply describing an appetite he regrets. It sits uncomfortably in the space between the two, exactly where the entire case sits. What happened to Swift Runner's body afterward is itself unresolved in the record, which feels in retrospect almost fitting. Some contemporary accounts suggest he was buried hastily in the snow just outside the fort's walls. Others believe his remains were eventually interred in what became the settlement's jail cemetery. And at least one researcher who has spent years combing the surviving documents has raised without any direct evidence beyond a working knowledge of Cree mortuary custom a third possibility, that his own relations may have come for the body and dealt with it the way Cree tradition prescribed for a confirmed Witiko, dismembering and burning the remains so that whatever had been riding inside him could never rise again to torment the living. We do not know which of these is true. We may never know. What we do know is that Swift Runner's case did not end the phenomenon it had become the most famous example of. Northern Alberta and the broader subarctic interior continued to produce isolated reports of Wendigo-afflicted individuals well into the early 20th century, a pattern serious enough that an Edmonton-based ethno-historian working through archival and oral sources generations later would coin the term Wendigo condition to describe the cluster of similar cases across the region, costing, by some estimates, dozens of lives over the following decades before it largely faded from the record alongside the way of life that had produced it. The hunger, whatever it actually was, seems to have needed a very specific set of conditions to take root. The total isolation of a winter trapline, a belief system that had already built a name and a shape for what was coming, and a kind of psychological solitude that the 20th century's roads, radios, and resettlement programs would eventually make almost impossible to recreate. If there is a version of Edmund Hale who carried this case with him for the rest of his career, and I suspect there were real men very much like him scattered across the frontier bar who did, I imagine what stayed with him was not the verdict, which had never really been in doubt, but the quiet, specific failure of his own training to produce a satisfying account of what he had witnessed. He had been raised to believe that any human action, however terrible, could in principle be traced back to a comprehensible chain of motive and circumstance, that the courtroom's whole purpose was to find that chain and weigh it. Swift Runner had handed him a man who killed without anger, who ate without hunger in any ordinary sense, who went to his death, not in denial or despair, but in something closer to relief, as though a long-running occupation of his own body had finally mercifully been allowed to end. The Cree had a name for that. English law, for all its careful machinery, did not, and standing at the edge of that gap, a rationalist has only two honest choices: insist the gap is an illusion and keep looking for the explanation that must be hiding somewhere in the file, or admit that some forms of human darkness were mapped first, and perhaps mapped more honestly by people his own civilization had spent 2 centuries refusing to take seriously as anything other than superstition. Either way, the file never quite closes. It is still open today in the strict sense that no psychiatrist, anthropologist, or historian has ever produced an account of Swift Runner's winter that fully satisfies the evidence, and in the looser, more enduring sense that travelers in the boreal forest belt stretching from Alberta to Labrador still on occasion report, the particular quality of dread that the old stories describe an unaccountable cold pressing in from the trees, a hunger that does not feel entirely like their own on the coldest, loneliest nights of the deepest winter.